Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the international politics of climate change. One of the three pillars of climate policy is called loss and damage. What is this? How has its meaning emerged, and how does it work in practice? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Climate change is having increasingly profound effects upon our world. Policy responses to climate change have come to be grouped into three pillars. First, there are efforts to tackle the causes of climate change, to cut carbon emissions and improve carbon capture. The experts tend to refer to these efforts, for reasons that I confess I've never fully understood, as mitigation. Second, there are efforts to adapt to the climate change that is occurring in order to minimise the harms caused, say by building seawalls higher or by improving the heat resilience of our homes. This element is more comprehensively known as adaptation. And third, there's the question of how we deal with the harms that do arise, of who bears the cost of those harms and whether they are or can be in any meaningful sense compensated. This has come to be called loss and damage. Well, today we are focusing on the third of those pillars, on loss and damage. The definition I just offered might be one way of understanding what loss and damage is, but it's not the only one. It turns out that how loss and damage should be described is contested, and different definitions, different framings of loss and damage are promoted by different participants in climate negotiations in order to advance the outcomes they want. Furthermore, that framing process is just one example of the ways in which the micro-processes of international climate talks are being shaped or constructed, perhaps sometimes manipulated, by those taking part, most effectively, inevitably, by those who already hold most power. Well, a new book examines these processes of shaping and argues that they are having a profound effect, a profound negative effect, on the efficacy of our global response to climate change in the loss and damage area. That book is by our wonderful colleague here in the UCL Department of Political Science, Lisa Van Halle. Professor of Political Science, UCL Vice Provost for the Grand Challenge theme of the climate crisis, and long-standing friend of the podcast. Lisa, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on again. And we're hopefully in this episode going to be going quite deep into the weeds, if you like, of climate negotiations on loss and damage. Before we do that, to ensure that our listeners can stick with us through some of this detail, could we maybe give a sense just of what's at stake here? So what fundamentally is loss and damage about? And what are the dangers if negotiations around loss and damage go wrong?
Yeah, well, loss and damage is really trying to address the losses that will result from climate change, of both those things that have economic value, so kind of declines in agricultural productivity or business operations or damage to infrastructure, but also those things that people hold dear. We know that in some places in the world, people's health and mental health are being already severely affected by climate change impacts. We know that homes will be lost. We know that given current trajectories, it's very likely that some small island states may disappear, may lose their kind of territorial dimension. And so in a lot of ways, the loss and damage agenda is really addressing those things that kind of people hold most dear to their heart, that stand to be lost because of the impacts of climate change, whether those are extreme weather events like hurricanes, typhoons, floods, heat waves, or these more kind of slow creeping hazards that maybe go under the radar a little bit, kind of the degradation of soil and water, the rising of sea levels, the melting of glaciers. And so there's a kind of whole breadth of losses that we might think about when we talk about the loss and damage agenda. And the international negotiations really matter here because about 15 years ago, the kind of realization that these are not just kind of local impacts experienced at the local level, but also have global consequences in terms of, for example, biodiversity loss that will affect many parts of the world. And ecosystems are kind of deeply interconnected, and what's lost in one place will matter in lots of other places. So that's one kind of dimension of the kind of global nature of this problem. But the other is that a lot of these losses are resulting because of global atmospheric warming, and that wasn't caused by the people living in these places that are experiencing those losses most acutely. So these issues that were conceptualized as local maybe 40, 50 years ago are all of a sudden now being understood to be a kind of global problem that needs addressing within these negotiations.
And you say it's about addressing these losses. What does addressing mean? Because it's not about preventing the losses, because that is what fits under the adaptation pillar, as I understand it, at least. So what do we mean by
So
addressing here?
yeah, I mean, there's some ambiguity around that. The language in the Paris Agreement actually refers to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And so there we think about the whole kind of breadth of policy tools that are useful across mitigation and adaptation. And of course, every kind of tenth of a degree of warming will result in more losses. And so one of the best ways of addressing loss and damage is by mitigating and then also by adapting. So there's a real kind of ambiguity, I suppose, as to kind of what we mean. But generally, when we think about responses to loss and damage, which is how the IPCC is starting to talk about this, we would think about things that those at the household, community, country, regional, and global level can do to address those things that are already being lost or will be lost in the future or are being damaged. So a concrete example might be something like a community that is situated on the coast is no longer viable because of either sea level rise and or the storm surges from kind of more extreme storms. And so it would address the kind of addressing loss and damage in that case might relate to kind of the way in which people leave that community. So different forms of human mobility that might be kind of the more displacement, kind of slightly chaotic form in response to a specific event, or addressing it proactively might entail community relocation. So a kind of managed way of trying to pick up and move this community and protect the elements related to community ties and making sure that people's well-being is taken care of and that they're looked after through this kind of migration process to be relocated somewhere else. So that would be a kind of concrete example of addressing loss and damage. And there are lots, and we
Mm.
can think about them across different sectors, from fisheries, agriculture, and all kinds of ways of thinking about
Do you want to
this.
maybe give us just a couple of other quick examples? Because we want to avoid having too narrow a conception of what it is that we're talking about as we go forward.
Yeah. So, for example, there's a kind of series of projects across some of the Pacific small island states related to cultural heritage that risks being lost due to rising sea levels. I've heard of one project, and I can't remember the specific island, but it's about kind of the protection or kind of recreation of historical cave drawings in a cave that will soon be underwater and the kind of recreation of that in a digital form in a museum so that those individuals and people visiting there can still have access to that cultural heritage site. So that might be a way of addressing loss and damage there. One that maybe sits in the gray zone of like, is this adaptation or is this loss and damage relates to livelihoods that might be changing. Some crops, for example, in some places are no longer going to be viable on a warming planet. And so, what are we doing with the kind of farmers or the kind of pastoralists who are maybe hurting certain kinds of animals in these places where this is no longer viable? So, developing projects to try and advance alternative livelihood options for these individuals might also be seen as a form of addressing loss.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. And in the book, you're focusing not on what's happening within states in this area, but what's happening in interstate negotiations. Perhaps again, it would be helpful just to get a sense of what are these negotiations? What are we talking about here before we go into the detail too far? So yeah, who's involved? Where are they happening? Yeah, give us a sense of what's going
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's great. And Alan, this is the perfect moment to be talking
on.
about this because the 30th round of these negotiations is happening as we speak in Belém in Brazil, kind of the gateway to the rainforest there. And so they've been happening for 30 years, right? And in some ways, that's kind of a precursor, I think, to our conversation to come of like what's actually being achieved here and the kind of moving goalposts within these negotiations, but they rotate from year to year. Different countries offer to host them. Last year, they were held in Azerbaijan, the year before that in Egypt, the year before that in the UAE. And so they kind of move around. And the COP negotiations themselves, and COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. And it doesn't mean conference the way that we think about it as political scientists. It's the conference in this sense means that they kind of gather the conglomerate of the states that have signed up to this treaty. And the treaty that we're talking about here is the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, and then the Paris Agreement, which was signed 10 years ago, which is really the kind of current basis upon which these meetings are what they're discussing and what they're trying to advance and what they're trying to clarify. But what happens is every year for 2 weeks, usually in November or December, diplomats come together to try and kind of work through what are the issues that are emerging in relation to what countries need to be doing to try to prevent and adapt to climate change and address loss and damage. And so usually on the first day or two, you will have world leaders kind of show up and help to set the agenda and provide kind of symbolic support and show who's there. And of course, this year, there are kind of some notable absences, particularly from the United States, which are in the process of pulling out of the Paris Agreement for the second time. I'm very pleased that Keir Starmer, our prime minister, did decide to go in the end. And that was a kind of U-turn because he had said he wouldn't first. But I think it was a really important kind of show of support for this multilateral process, which is really under pressure at the moment. And then those world leaders go home and the kind of mid-level diplomats come in and do the kind of technical work and try and advance negotiations on some of the technical issues. And by the end of the first week, what's becoming apparent is that some of these issues are not going to be easily resolved. And so what happens in the second week is ministers start to arrive. And so you have those who have more kind of political power and support who take over the negotiations in the second week. And what we have tended to have over the last decade is really in the last 24, 36 hours of the negotiations, things start to become really heated. The kind of final thorny issues are being hammered out. And the whole kind of idea behind the COP negotiations is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so it's quite easy and the stakes are quite high in terms of the whole thing falling apart. And so the negotiation year after year continue to go ever so slightly longer. And so they're meant to finish usually on the Friday of the second week and have in recent years been going in well into the Saturday and sometimes even into the Sunday. And what you'll have there is the kind of most difficult issues dealt with by the ministers.
Okay, that's the context for your research. It's really helpful for us to have that as grounding for our further conversation. Let's pivot towards the research itself now. And as we've been hinting, that research focuses very much on the processes of these negotiations, how things really work on the ground. Why did you think that would be interesting? Before you did the research, why did you think really going into the detail of what's happening in the room among these bureaucrats, these diplomats, was going to help our understanding?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alan. And I have to confess that I did 8 years of ethnographic work on this project. And there are moments where I was watching kind of long, drawn out meetings, very bureaucratic, kind of quite technical, and wondering why on earth I had signed up to spend hours and hours watching other people have meetings, right? We have meetings in our own lives as it is. But, at the time I was teaching our undergraduate class on global environmental politics, and loss and damage was just emerging as a new pillar of policymaking and was really novel. And it was in 2013 when I first joined the department and was starting to teach this course that there was this kind of empirical pull of like, what is this thing that everyone's talking about? And even after talking to people, I didn't really understand. And it was kind of quite clear that some of them didn't really even know fully what it meant and how it would translate. And so empirically, it was quite exciting. But also one of the things that I noticed in the literature is that there was an awful lot of focus on what comes out of these COP decisions and the kind of the headlines that come out of these COP decisions, and much less focus on what happens all the rest of the year and what these diplomats are doing and the members of the UNFCCC Secretariat and this whole cadre of kind of international bureaucrats and how they're carrying forward these decisions that come out of COP that are really high profile and get a lot of attention, but then they're taken into another process. And that's what happens all the rest of the year. So we have I've talked about COP, but in June, we have these meetings of the subsidiary bodies of the convention, which are kind of smaller rounds of the negotiation. And then the various UNFCCC committees are meeting all year long. And so I was observing what was happening in one of the executive committee for loss and damage, which is a group of 20 people, 10 developing country diplomats, 10 developed country diplomats, and they were trying to advance this agenda on loss and damage. And you get these big headlines coming out of COP, and then nothing would really happen. And then you would go back to COP again, and it was like, well, what's happened with that? And so I really had this kind of puzzle of like, what's happening in this implementation phase of global public policy? We know a lot about how agreements are made, and that's something that's really been studied a lot by political scientists and legal scholars. And we know a lot less about what's happening in this implementation moment. And I suppose the third thing was really thinking about the kind of data that we were relying on in global climate politics. And there's a lot of work based on interviews. And I just began to think, actually, maybe the things that people are telling us isn't the whole story. Maybe there are things that we can learn by going and sitting in these spaces and watching these people and noticing contradictions or tensions or interactions in a way. And so I really wanted to kind of move beyond relying on semi-structured interviews as the only way of constructing a story about what's happening in these spaces.
So the analysis that you do is based partly on interviews, partly on these observations, partly also on reading all the documentation around this as well. How do you put all of that material together? So presumably in the observations, you're sitting taking notes on what people are saying, what they're doing, how their body language, all of that kind of thing. How do you distill all of that vast body of material, I'm guessing, and draw an analysis out of it?
I'd say slowly and with difficulty. I had an amazing team of early career researchers, and we had like huge amounts of data because often they were observing in different rooms to mine. They were conducting interviews and we were trying to pull it all together. And so the way that we approach that is by developing an analytical framework in a very inductive way. And I was relying on my years and years of kind of field notes, not knowing in any particular meeting what may or may not be important later on. And so I spent years really kind of like, yeah, I think that the kind of soaking and poking in those notes as a way. And so maybe let me give you one example for I went through all of my field notes, and every time someone in one of the meetings or the negotiations made a joke, I kind of highlighted it in green. And I didn't know that this was necessarily going to matter, but knew from ethnographic work before that like jokes can be quite revelatory of different kinds of dynamics within any particular kind of space. And so what I did was I went through all these field notes, was looking at what's happening related to these jokes, and then pulling those into a kind of qualitative memo of like jokes, right? And what's kind of happening. And through that, I was able to kind of start to see patterns of who was making the jokes and what was their purpose in making those jokes. And sometimes it can be lightening the mood. Sometimes it can be signaling something to another negotiator. Sometimes it can be a way of building a bridge and kind of developing camaraderie. And in other moments, it can feel really like the opposite. And so seeing the kind of text of what the joke was, but also having the broader kind of context of who laughed and who didn't, or who got up out of their chair after that moment, or who tried to speak over that, it really started to, I suppose, kind of emerge this kind of picture of what's going on in these particular spaces and what's being taken seriously. And when are people feeling moments of tension that are effectively lightened through these jokes and when they aren't. And so that's one example. And I dealt with all kinds of issues related to the data of like how they talked about certain topics or didn't talk about certain topics. And one of the things I think I really wanted to be alive to in this book are the kind of silences, like what issues are not brought forward. And I draw on the work of one of my research assistants on the project, Frederica Hartz, who's just recently finished her PhD in Cambridge, on this idea of kind of tabooization of certain topics. And I trace that in the book of kind of how actually the term compensation, which you used in the intro here, was not one I ever heard used kind of openly in a negotiating room. And so I think it was effectively rendered taboo in this particular space. And then I would ask stories about those silences And so when I was doing the interviews, I would ask people like, why are you not mentioning this? Because you talk about compensation in this policy brief you put together, but in this room you haven't mentioned it. And why not? And then you start to kind of hear further stories and are able to do that thing that I think the triangulation work of like the different data points and trying to kind of piece the story together.
It's so interesting how you describe that, because I guess on the one hand, you want to be going in with an open mind and ready to see whatever is there. But on the other hand, if you go in with no kind of prior expectations or thoughts on what you might be looking out for, you just be completely overwhelmed by all the vast numbers of things that you could notice in that context. So there's kind of a balance to be struck between those things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the interpretivist scholars tend to think of this as, whereas positivists like to talk about a deductive method where you start with theory and then you go and test it against data, or an inductive method where you just go in completely open. Interpretivist scholars talk about this kind of hermeneutic circle, or they talk about it as abductivism. So, this idea of you're constantly moving between what you know and have read and what the existing literature is telling you about what to expect and what's maybe surprising or confirmatory or kind of newly illuminating in the field. And those moments of surprise are just they're just I mean, they're wonderful when you're doing this kind of work and really
Yeah.
exciting.
Could you give us an example?
Yeah, so there's one I talk about in the book of, and it was my first time attending this executive committee meeting of like the body that's trying to implement some of these agreements that are reached at COP on loss and damage. And they would meet in Bonn. And so I was going to Bonn kind of 2 or 3 times a year and watching these meetings that tended to be open to observers for like 3 days at a time. And you would know that they had probably met for 2 days before that in a closed session. And I would often hear about, as I developed relationships, what happened in those closed sessions, either from negotiators or from people who had access or knew what was happening in there. But the very first kind of day that I went to observe one of these, and I was with a research assistant who I had sent to watch one of the previous meetings that I couldn't attend. And I just said, just go and kind of see what happens and familiarize yourself with kind of the characters or the kind of stakeholders in the room. And so when I first went, we spent a day watching this meeting, and I was struggling with all the acronyms because the UNFCCC is just, it's got its own language and its own codes, and insiders know them and outsiders don't. And so I was struggling with already the kind of entry into the field, and I was talking with Harriet about my expectations of what we would find. And what I had thought we would find based on previous work in international relations is that there would be this kind of effort to try and appear to be a united front as an executive committee. And that her job and my job was going to be trying to find evidence of a divide between developed and developing countries. Even though I knew that the kind of history had been very contentious, my thought is this group of people are all tasked with trying to implement something and trying to do that together, and to some extent putting their kind of identities as developed or developing country behind them. And so we were talking about this very issue as we walked into a pizza restaurant in Bonn, which is quite a well-known one. And as we were walking in, I saw her jaw drop, and there at the table, like right where, the kind of you're meant to wait to be seated, there was a kind of table of like 10 developed country negotiators and some of their colleagues who were there observing as well. And we just couldn't believe it. And there is this moment in the UNFCCC where the diplomats that feel like celebrities or something, like you know who they are because you have spent hours and hours watching them in meetings, and they don't really know who you are. They might recognize you, but they don't really know who you are and what you're doing there. And so there was this celebrity moment of like, oh my goodness, there's like all these people I've just been watching all day. And wait a minute, they're all from developed countries. And like, I would have thought that there would be kind of a little more camaraderie across global North, global South lines here. And so really that moment kind of flipped the project in some way on its head. I'm like, okay, I don't need to look for evidence here of like division. This is a different kind of project now, and let's see what comes.
Yeah, one of the nice things about the book is you start all of the main chapters with a little vignette, one of these little stories that somehow captures something important about what you're looking at. That's a theme that we might well return to, but let's focus in now on some of the substance of your analysis. And the first area that you look at is what you call framing. So the battle around how to describe and define what loss and damage actually is. Do you want to outline what the core of your analysis is here?
Yeah, I've long drawn on Irving Goffman's work in my thinking about kind of social movements and the work that I did previously on legal mobilization and why groups might see and understand the law as relevant for them, whereas other groups don't. And so I drew on Irving Goffman's work on frame analysis here to really try and unpick this idea of there is no formal definition of loss and damage, even still today as we speak, at least under the UNFCCC. And that's a slightly strange thing, considering we have now set up all these kind of global governance institutions, including a new fund to address loss and damage. And yet there's this unwillingness to define it. And so I was really kind of curious about what was happening there and that ambiguity. And so what I did is I used Goffman's kind of framework for thinking about frames to do the analysis, to kind of go through some of the early interviews and a lot of the documentary sources and data and what was kind of emerging in law as loss and damage was being formed, to really try and unpick two different understandings of loss and damage, and to show that actually stakeholders were talking about it in different ways and trying to advance it in different ways. And so on one hand, you had this kind of more climate justice framing, which we started this conversation with, this idea that climate change is causing like a whole range of harms around the world, and that we want to call those harms loss and damage, and that this is a question of kind of the responsibility of historic emitting states, so rich countries, to then kind of remedy those harms. And so this particular framing of loss and damage is very justice oriented, very concerned with harm. The stakeholders tend to really push on the idea of kind of permanent losses, emphasize the importance of, what has come to be called in that space the non-economic losses, all those losses we hold of things we hold most dear: life, health, community, biodiversity, right? And really emphasizing the kind of intangibility of loss as well as the economic losses. And that all relates to this issue of compensation for climate change harms. And what flows from that particular framing is this idea of like, this is absolutely an issue to be addressed at the global level, and that global governance institutions should really be developed in a well resourced, well supported in other ways kind of manner, and that they should be really proactively trying to think about how do we address these kinds of losses. I also began to notice a different framing of loss and damage being put forward by mainly developed country stakeholders. And this was one that was much more technocratic in nature. It focused a lot, at least in the early years, on the kind of uncertainty and the uncertainty about the science around climate change. And I think that has changed a lot. But what is emphasized now is the uncertainty of whether any particular kind of extreme weather event or slow onset is actually related to climate change, and the extent to which it's climate change that is causing the harm, as opposed to like a national government's poor development practices, for example, of like building communities on coastal areas that are otherwise vulnerable. And so you had a lot of emphasis on this idea of kind of risk and uncertainty. And from that flows a kind of set of suggestions that actually maybe the UNFCCC isn't even the right place to be having this conversation. Maybe this is something that should be dealt with just at the national level. And I provide lots of evidence in the book of kind of that case being made by the United States, by the EU in the early years of these conversations. When there was acknowledgement by these stakeholders that actually maybe there is some global dimension here, they would argue that this is something to be situated within our kind of international regime dealing with disaster risk and disaster risk reduction. And at that time, it was the Hyogo framework, and now it's the Sendai framework. And that matters because that's a voluntary kind of bottom up kind of framework. It doesn't have the legal heft that the UNFCCC does. So by trying to shift this issue into that particular space, these states were trying to kind of do something in terms of, again, minimizing their own responsibility for addressing this issue. And so I argue that these two different framings, they come with different diagnoses of this problem that we call loss and damage. and different kind of suggestions on how best to address that problem in terms of public policy and in terms of the different role that different stakeholders should be playing and the different role that global governance institutions should take in addressing this problem. And what I try and trace is show that these two different framings were kind of for a time put aside to reach an agreement at one of these COPs in 2013 to embed loss and damage in there and to include it in the Paris Agreement in 2015 in its own article. But actually, these two different framings never really go away and they start to emerge and kind of pop up within these new institutions. And so, what we tend to have is a kind of continuation of those politics of like, what is loss and damage in other places, and that continues. That hasn't ever really disappeared, I think, even to this day.
So is it? So I think you're also arguing that how these framings develop over time is being shaped very strongly by the actors involved who are consciously seeking to promote framings that fundamentally serve their interests. And so is it that they're deliberately maintaining ambiguity because so long as there's ambiguity, it's hard to act? Or is it also an element that actually the second interpretation, the interpretation of the global north, that's maybe too simple, but kind of wins out over time, and it wins out over time because they're just more powerful?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the ambiguity, it goes from being something constructive in terms of embedding something in international law to something that then becomes quite destructive and it is really taken up by the developed countries in trying to just delay discussions about, well, who's going to take responsibility for this problem that we can't even really agree on what it is. And so I think developing countries have a very clear sense of what this problem is because they are living it all the time and it's affecting them. And it's affecting developed countries as well, too. And maybe it's important to be clear that in this UNFCCC space, when we talk about loss and damage, we're talking about how to support vulnerable countries, so developing countries that are experiencing these impacts. And so that ambiguity is certainly kind of picked up and used as a way of delaying. And one of the reasons I really like frame analysis and prefer it to kind of the discourse analytic approach, which, is also kind of deployed a lot in the literature on global climate and politics and other areas of international relations, is that the framing approach, I think, really allows for clarity around when these frames are being deployed strategically rather than discourses, which are really just mapping what's actually happening within a particular discourse without looking at that question of kind of who's advancing this set of framings with what audience in mind and what are they trying to achieve by doing it. So it brings in that kind of strategic element. It doesn't preclude the fact that for some, it's also sincere and it's this kind of sincere form of trying to kind of communicate in advance, but that it allows for that kind of understanding of manipulation and strategy as well.
Really interesting. I'm very keen that we should squeeze in some discussion also of your analysis of the practice of the negotiations and the behavior that takes place in these negotiations. And I mean, I guess the pizza restaurant example is kind of one case of this, but you draw here on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who may be a source of some fear to some of our listeners because he's one of these French social theorists to have a reputation for being a little bit obscure and difficult to understand. But what is it that you take from the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and how does that help in your analysis of these negotiations?
Yeah. And part of what I'm trying to do with the ethnography is kind of construct a picture of these practices. How does like kind of the everyday politic of diplomacy shape some of these outcomes that we see? And so I draw on Bourdieu really and use several kind of tools, kind of thinking tools that Bourdieu puts forward. And he has these kind of funny names for them, but really there's kind of a couple I think that I would draw attention to. So one is the idea of a habitus, and we all have a habitus, and that's kind of our way of being and our way of doing, and that we to some extent kind of just it's embodied, it's kind of something we just do. And his other concept is one of doxa, and the doxa within a particular sphere is the kind of taken for granted knowledge And the way that knowledge has been talked about in global climate politics has tended to be science and evidence and kind of literature on epistemic communities. But there's also this kind of doxa, common, taken for granted ways of doing diplomacy and like what's appropriate and what isn't. And so I was trying to track, for example, when someone joined this committee for the first time, some of the faux pas that they made in terms of how they talked about some of these issues around loss and damage, and inadvertently upset some of their colleagues who they were meant to be kind of allied with because they had accidentally said something that generally the global south would have been putting forward. And this was a negotiator from the global north, but who had a background in development. And so what I try and do is trace through kind of how some of these, I suppose, embodied practices and unspoken ways of interacting, as well as spoken ways of kind of relating to each other, shapes what happens in these particular spaces. And I also try and draw on the kind of literature that's emerging on kind of the post-human and how to study that in anthropology and geography and material politics. And we have wonderful colleagues in the geography department at UCL doing work in this space, and that I have had the pleasure of engaging with, have really taught me how to kind of see the power of materials in a different way. And so the way in which kind of chairs were deployed in some of these rooms as a way of showing who has power, who is left to sit on the floor, like who moves for someone else. And so those kinds of ways of human and non-human interaction, I think then also began to play in how I use Bourdieu and tried to use some of those thinking tools to understand what was happening in a particular space that maybe wasn't what I would have found if I had just looked at a transcript of the meeting.
And you're also arguing that these patterns profoundly matter. So you're also arguing
Yes.
that they don't just have kind of incidental or sort of amusing, entertaining, and anecdotal effects upon, but they have kind of deep structural effects as well.
Yes. Yeah. And what I'm trying to show is really like a lot of the literature on kind of framing or discourses kind of stops at the point where, oh, this set of frames makes this set of kind of governance institutions or policies plausible, but it doesn't necessarily trace through kind of how and why it results in certain kinds of outcomes or not. And so by linking this literature on framing and practices, what I'm trying to show is that this one particular way of understanding loss and damage then shapes the kinds of practices that are beginning to emerge in this moment as institutions are being built. And that relates to all kinds of things, such as kind of what kinds of expertise is valued here and what isn't, and who is allowed a seat at the table and who isn't. And so those practices are shaped by that earlier set of frames and understandings. And it's kind of those frames are instantiated through these institutions, and they become embodied by the people and the kinds of expertise that are brought in to address this question. So when we look at the composition, for example, of the kind of first executive committee on loss and damage, there was no one there who had expertise on migration or public health or biodiversity loss. It tended to be a lot of people, particularly from developed countries, who had expertise on disaster risk management. And that was the framing that they were bringing into. And they probably, a lot of them weren't aware. I mean, some of them told me in interviews they weren't really sure when they walked in the room what they were doing there. So they had been appointed because someone had understood this particular committee to be seen through the lens of disaster risk reduction. And then all of a sudden, there's these colleagues from the developing South talking about a whole breadth of other issues that they feel kind of ill equipped to deal with. And so, Bourdieu, I think, helps us understand sometimes how we're put in situations where we're not fully understanding or kind of explicitly complicit in advancing a particular understanding or form of distinction or kind of classification. And and that was really interesting to see kind of playing out in this way. Bourdieu really came to life for me through watching that particular committee.
Really interesting. And that then in turn has an impact on outcomes and a
Yeah.
fundamental impact on the policies that might be adopted or might be proposed through these processes.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. We kind of did really careful analysis of like their work plans and which issues tended to progress more quickly. And it was those that fit in that category of things that would fall into that framing of loss and damage that was being pushed by developed countries. So One of the first groups to be set up was that on comprehensive risk management. And it took years and years for the one related to kind of finance, which is called action and support, to be set up. And the one on non-economic losses had a kind of few false starts. And again, so those issues that relate to those, the kind of framing of the problem that was held most dear by developing countries, all of that work was delayed compared to the work that was being advanced, the kind of perspectives that were being advanced by developed countries and the expertise that was brought in by those developed country negotiators.
Yeah. You also say towards the end of the book that this is a quotation from the book. You say, what this book makes clear is that what is lost in the loss and damage discussions is loss itself. That is, the human emotions of bereavement, anger, and sorrow that are almost inevitable byproducts of loss. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it was something that as I was writing the book, this is one of the kind of silences, I suppose, in the space that I was watching is some of the negotiators from the developing countries were seeing things happening at home, floods or kind of catastrophic heat waves that were killing large numbers of people. And whenever those were invoked in the room, it kind of shut things down. Or developed countries would come in and be like, "Oh, well, we have wildfires too," there was just yeah, it just felt like that, what Bourdieu would articulate as the kind of doxa, the kind of what you can do in this space, didn't allow for actually acknowledging what was happening here and the work that was being done. And the fact that the COP negotiations were set up to try and stop like dangerous human interference in the climate system, and that we're now at a point where that has clearly failed and that's not being acknowledged. And so any kind of grief or anger was just any time, the very few times I saw that invoked, it was shut down very quickly. It was shut down very quickly in these meetings. And I think actually, and we could look to kind of feminist scholars, I think, who more explicitly theorize kind of the role of emotions and affect in international relations to kind of look for ways forward on how that could be brought in. I think another way in which it's excluded is several times I saw civil society organizations or developing countries arguing for some of these meetings to be held in places that had experienced loss or to bring in those with lived experience of climate change impacts to talk about what that was like for them and to kind of begin to think about co-constructing solutions based on the experience of those who have lived through this. And all of those suggestions were really shut down. And I traced a few of them in the book. But there was this wanting to keep a lot of the reality of what we're talking about with loss and damage very much at arm's length and very much at a distance and not wanting to look at it in a way, which is paradoxical because these people's job is to address this issue. And so, and in some ways, that's just a part of UN politics. I mean, this whole idea of kind of doing a deterritorialized ethnography by studying these places. And that's a term that the anthropologist Sally Engelmary put forward when she was studying the kind of UN women's rights regime. And the UN meetings are like really uncanny in how they look really similar no matter what country they're held in. They're held all over the place, all around the world. And yet every time you walk in, the setup looks almost exactly the same. And so there is this kind of not wanting to look at this problem in some ways that I think is a really kind of profound, really profound in terms of what we're trying to achieve through our international cooperation here.
Yes. We're going to have to wrap up very soon. We've already gone way over our time, but this is just such important stuff to talk about. Before we stop, I guess I understand the book fundamentally as exposing how power is being exercised in this space. And I wonder, by understanding how power is exercised, is it possible to resist that power more effectively? Is there stuff that can be done as a result of the analysis in this book that would help the final outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think maybe that's a whole other book, Alan, is like thinking about what does this diagnosis then suggest in terms of our like discussions, which are really live at the moment about reforms of this process, about being honest about what it's achieving and what it's not achieving and why it's not achieving what it's achieving. And I hope this offers a kind of useful, very clear-eyed sense of kind of some of what's not working within the heart of this process itself. what I did find heartening is that I did see some of those forms of resistance to ways of doing things and to manipulation and to calling it out. And particularly in the kind of committee that was set up to talk about finance, there was real pushback on some of this. And so it's not a kind of blanket picture. And what I'm trying to do is show where that power is being exerted. And then I think you're right. I think maybe it's about thinking through what are the kind of micro level forms of resistance, but also when we're having conversations about reforming these institutions or about setting up new ones, that we're not replicating and reproducing the problems that we're experiencing within this regime as it's currently working and functioning.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It's a really terrific book. I feel very privileged to have had the chance to read it and talk with you about it for so long.
Thanks, Alan.
We have been discussing the book Governing the End, The Making of Climate Change, Loss and Damage, published this year by the University of Chicago Press. And we will, as ever, put full details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we're looking at post-colonial global justice. To make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.